And then the interview process is important, because even if you meet the eligibility criteria, we do interview all candidates. And the reason for this is that this is not like working at a chicken factory or a nuts and bolts factory. You're dealing with very vulnerable populations, and therefore we want people who holistically demonstrate themselves to be fairly rounded individuals, fairly mature, with a degree of insight and reflexivity, and also people who have some basic skills already in interpersonal face-to-face work with people in client groups. Now that, again, it doesn't mean that they're kind of experienced therapists, but it does mean that you would know how to behave if you were sent out to knock on somebody's door because they had a problem. You would have some idea about how to behave and interview people if they were in a clinic setting or possibly a voluntary sector setting, that you already actually have some baseline, we would call them clinical skills, other people might call them professional interpersonal skills. And so when we interview people, we're partly looking for those sorts of elements and the ability to reflect on your own ability to perform and to, I suppose, respond to constructive feedback from other people, but also to recognise flaws in your own practice yourself and think, well, I won't do that again. Of course, that didn't go very well. And so all candidates are interviewed, and the interview process currently involves you apply mostly online, and then you will be either invited for interview if you meet the eligibility criteria. If it's your background suggests that you need KSA route in, you would be sent the KSA, which we'll talk about in a minute, and given a month, I think it is at the moment, to fill the portfolio in. We might extend that period. And then when the KSA is okay, all the requirements are met, then you would be invited for interview. And the current interview process can last up to a whole day, and it involves asking applicants to do a 10-minute assessment role play, which one of the interviewers will actually effectively assess while you're doing it, the quality of it. Then you're asked to create a formulation from that. It can be diagrammatic or narrative, and the formulation just means an explanation of what you think the problem is, how it developed, and what's maintaining it. You do that, you can do it in a diagrammatic or by writing down answers to those 3 questions. And then we ask the candidates to actually give us feedback on how well they think they did the assessment, what were the strengths and weaknesses of it, and we give them mirrored feedback on the same issues.
If I can just, chip in there, because it's my experience, because although I run the online programme, sometimes I'm also fortunate to be part of the interviewing and selection process for the Master's programme. And that was quite interesting for me, because sometimes, although people have done the online programme, so they've actually looked very carefully at what skills and what formulation is and these sort of things, that they don't seem to connect it that well with the actual interview process. So I think this is a good point and a good time to say, what you're learning now will actually really influence your ability to demonstrate these skills in an interview situation. So thanks for that.
Well, absolutely. And of course, in an interview situation, even people sometimes are very experienced don't do particularly well, partly because it's a false situation, partly because a 10-minute assessment is actually extraordinarily difficult to do, much more difficult than a 40-minute assessment, and partly just because of the conditions, which are a bit like exam conditions. I mean, not exam, but it might feel to somebody who was an applicant that you're under pressure to perform on the hoof, as it were, which you are. So it isn't the easiest process. On the other hand, of course, we're used to doing this year in, year out, and we have a kind of reasonable idea in our head of what a reasonable performance looks like, and we're almost as interested in people's ability to calibrate and reflect on their performance. So if an applicant actually gives a fairly poor performance, but is able to say, oh well, I was really nervous and I should have made eye contact that I didn't, and I realised I looked at my knees quite a lot and lost my place a few times. If the candidate is able to spot what they did wrong, that's almost a strength, so that can counterbalance even quite a poor performance.
Yeah, and the ability to accept feedback as well is if people sort of say, and it's happened when I've been part of the process where you've said to someone, you know, they've given feedback and said, well, I don't think I did very well on this, and you said, well, yes, it wasn't very good. For them to be able to take that in the spirit that it's meant and not become defensive is also quite important. And particularly with CBT, because that's going to be part of their role for a long time to come, isn't it? Because often the skills are watched either live or recorded. So it's quite a skill to develop, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I mean, eventually people who are coming on the CBP courses need to get used, I suppose, to the idea that various people will be looking at their practice. This is an integral part of the learning process, and those two elements, that you get feedback from other people, those other people can be clinical supervisors, academic staff, and of course clients, and they also are able to reflect on their own practice with the help of those external comments, but also sometimes just on their own to think, well, what did I do and what could I have done better, and why did this happen, and how can I manage it differently in the future. So that's the more or less the process, and then really the candidate is told on the day whether they've got a place.
Could do a formal interview.
Yeah, sorry, there's a formal interview after all that. There's 20 minutes.
Right, so
the process is finished off by a formal interview which lasts about 20 minutes, where we ask candidates a few questions. Well, I don't know, there's a number of different questions which we're able to choose from, and the candidate of course is allowed to and encouraged to ask us questions, because we might decide that a candidate is not ready for the course, or maybe needs to do something additional, or maybe there's something problematic about their presentation for the interview. But equally, a candidate might decide that this course is not for me, and we want the ability to have that sort of negotiation with the candidate. And then generally at the end of this rather lengthy process of interviewing, the candidate is told the outcome, which will be a conditional offer. That might be on producing an extra reference, or because there's some problem with their paperwork, or they're waiting for a qualification or an accreditation to come through, or an unconditional offer, which is what it sounds like. And occasionally we will say to candidates, we don't really think you're ready, but if you wanted to apply in the future, these are the things you would need to do. Now, the children's programme is very similar, but when we have a lot of children's applicants and can arrange for them all to be seen on one day, which is actually quite difficult, doesn't happen that often, we sometimes use a children and young people's panel, and that would substitute for the short role play and the elements that go with that. And how that works is the children's panel have devised a set of questions, and they run a 20-minute interview with the candidates, and using the questions they've devised, and they give us feedback afterwards on how they think the candidates responded and whether they think they would be good people to work with children and young people. And although the programme staff have the final veto and final decision, we obviously do take quite a lot of notice of what the young people say, and also offer that feedback back to the candidates for them to reflect on. And this is a really good process, but it has certain practical limitations, because it's only practical to bring the young people in when we've got maybe eight children's candidates to interview on a day, so it only happens sporadically. But there is that other process which I think is a better process for the children's schools, but we don't always run it, so it will be one or the other of these two processes.
Yeah. Okay. And then of course on top of that paperwork, there's a need for a criminal record bureau check, which I suppose is probably common to most people these days.
Yeah.
It's not transferable, you have to have it done wherever you move to. And references.
Yes, and with both courses, when the candidates apply, they're also asked to submit a handwritten essay about CBP. And this goes back to something I mentioned earlier about people needing basically the ability to demonstrate they can work at degree level and to be able to write in grammatical English. And we ask people to handwrite the essay, one so that we can be sure that they haven't got dyslexia and might need support, because we need them to go through support services, because candidates will do better supported if they've got a problem. And this is easier to tell if things are handwritten, and also obviously it's to try and stop people plagiarising material from the internet. And the other thing is the essay gives us an opportunity to see if students understand some basic academic requirements that you would have at degree level, like being able to reference a piece of work. Again, it's not marked in any formal sense, we're just seeing how the candidates manage the task, and then if there's an issue with something about this essay, that will be discussed at interview. So I should make it, those complicated, to make it quite clear that it's very much a negotiated process. Although we have all these guidelines, there is a degree of flexibility in the way that we operate them.
Yeah, and I think, from the outside looking in, when I've been part of it, what I've been struck by is actually it does mirror the collaborative nature of CBP in a lot of respects, in that, it is collaborative, that candidates do know what's going to happen, when and why, and hopefully by the end of the day when they leave, they know why the outcome has been decided upon.
And the outcome may well offer some very direct advice. So for instance, if we had one of these essays in and it was poorly referenced, we might talk to the person about, well, do you know how to do academic referencing? And if that was, not quite a small flaw, and the candidate had written quite a good essay but it's badly referenced, might suggest to them that they go and actually read some guidelines for referencing, and maybe submit another little piece just reference. So it's not just open and shut, these decisions. They have quite a lot of discretion and negotiation. And obviously we want to encourage candidates to demonstrate themselves in their best light, and to offer support where they need it, because it's better to support a candidate who's highly motivated and wants to do the course, as long as they have the basic requirements, than just turn people away. That's not really what we want to do. But there have to be some guidance and guidelines, because it is a very, very demanding course and not really for the faint-hearted. So I suppose partly the interview process is very thorough, but it's also designed in a way to say to people, if you want to do this course, this is almost a metaphor for how the course is. The course is demanding and arduous and looks at a lot of different aspects of the way the candidate is going to perform in various ways. And the interview process mirrors that.